sign up will actually join as well. But yeah, let's get going. Okay,
Well
so
said.
welcome everyone to Grand Ventures Future of EdTech with Jamie and Jeremy. So the format for today is as follows. First goal is to just better understand both Jamie and Jeremy's extensive backgrounds in EdTech. And then we're going to discuss three topic areas. The first is going to be K-12 education, which has obviously changed a lot because of COVID. The other one is the role of corporations in education technology. And the last is diversity and inclusion. So all really salient topics that everyone's been thinking about this year. And then after that, we'll do kind of more advice for EdTech entrepreneurs and general Q&A. And with that, Moses, I'll let you kind of introduce the speakers and kick it off.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to those of you joining us from who knows where. First of all, I'm really excited to be here today with two great entrepreneurs and educators who've been working and building amazing education companies. Today we have Jeremy, who's also a fellow Wolverine. Really sad about last night. It was heartbreaking loss to UCLA. But anyhow, really excited to have Jeremy with us today, who's a veteran in the tech space, worked at Apple, LinkedIn, and has been in the sort of the education ed tech space for the past 5 to 10 some years, with being a VP at Fidelis Education and now sort of head of product marketing at Khan Academy. Really excited to have Jeremy with us today. And we've got Jamie, who's also a veteran in the education technology space and has had several amazing exits of her own. We kind of run down the list of the companies she's been a part of. They are sort of the staples in ed tech and education, a VP of marketing at Academic Partnerships, which got acquired, Senior Vice President at 2U, which got acquired, General Assembly, the Vice President there, then got acquired, and was the Chief Revenue Officer at Trilogy Education, which got acquired. Now she's on to starting a new venture called Edge Pathways. Really excited to be involved. Hear more about that today. And Jamie, let me know if I can get on that cap table. I believe with your track record, could get a nice exit there. But anyhow, really excited to have both of you join us today and hear your stories and just have a conversation about where ed tech is today and where things are going in the future. But maybe just to kick things off, maybe I'll start with Jeremy. Can you just share a little bit about why you got into ed tech in the first place? Love to hear that.
First of all, I just want to thank you, Moses and Rohit, for hosting today. Super excited to be here, and thank everyone for joining us in the audience. I think my passion for EdTech really came from these two threads in my life. One was that I'd always been a big believer in the power of education, and actually started as a kindergarten teacher in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, when I launched my career. But at the same time, I was also just a huge nerd. I was more excited about building my classroom blog and teaching my kids to make PowerPoint than I was about other things. And so always wanted to find a way to combine those two passions, and EdTech was sort of the perfect sweet spot. So I've been lucky enough to work, like you said, on LinkedIn's education team at Khan Academy, doing some EdTech businesses myself, just to sort of bring those two passions together. So super excited to share those experiences today.
Yeah. And how about you, Jamie? Can you share just a little bit why you got into ed?
Sure. So I am a law school dropout. Excuse me. And I was actually one of the first, probably 50 people that worked at Kaplan. And I vividly remember Andy Rosen standing in front of me. I was probably 22 years old, saying, you want to work in education because you always want to be able to go home and tell your grandma that you're really proud of what you did at the end of the day. And the second student I ever enrolled, her name was Barbara. I enrolled her in a bachelor's 2+2 program at KU for-profit, if you guys, anyone's old enough to remember that. I got something in the mail about a year after I enrolled her. It was popsicles attempted to be put together from her kid. And it said, "Thank you. I was able to go to sleepaway camp this summer because my mom got a raise because of her degree." And I was like, okay, I can do this. Education startups are going to be my drug of choice. And super fortunate. Moses, I appreciate you giving me this lovely intro. I sound great on paper. What I'm actually, the only thing I'm really good at is finding people like Moses or Jeremy. I'm pretty good at being like the mouth to your brains and then taking credit for the ideas that you guys come up with because I execute them.
Come on, underselling yourself so much there.
Yeah. It's pretty simple, right? Like Moses, I think, and Jeremy, I've known you on and off through the years. I think if you genuinely give a shit and always keep the student top of mind, you're not going to lose in ed tech.
Yeah.
When you lose that sort of North Star of always what's doing in the best interest of the student, that you lose.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good segue, just to talk about this passion and love for students. Obviously, when you're running an education business, sort of keeping students sort of at the heartbeat, can you just share a little bit about how the two of you sort of see the work that you do in keeping students first, and how do you kind of maintain that as an entrepreneur? Love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
Go for it, Jeremy. You go first.
Okay. So I think, it's really tricky, because one of the things that probably has messed up education in this country is just the sort of economic model where you have all these different buyers, whether it's a higher education administrator or a district leader, and then you have multiple end users, from teachers to parents to students, and they're often different parties, so their incentives are kind of misaligned. And so I think it's really easy, whether it's at Khan Academy or in a startup, to say, hey, we're going to serve our buyer first and foremost, because they're the one who's ultimately paying our salaries.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the student comes at the bottom of that totem pole, because ultimately, who cares? At the end of the day, they're not the ones who signs the checks. But I do think that, like, in the long term, to Jamie's point, results do matter. And if your students aren't successful, if they're not getting results, then the buyer is going to see that at some point. And maybe that sort of reaction cycle is a little too slow in education, which is why some incumbents get stuck in there for a while, not delivering great results. But I do think if you want to build an evergreen, sustainable business that will stand the test of time, you do have to remember, at the end of the day, you have to change lives, exactly like Jamie talked about. And if you're not doing that, why are you in this business?
At some point, people are going to realize whether you're impacting students' lives or not, and helping them achieve their goals. Jamie, any thoughts on that for yourself, after being in so many different education businesses, keeping students sort of a top of mind and priority?
Yeah, I think it's all about choosing the right team to work on and work with, right? And so, and sort of researching them in non-traditional ways. And I'll use 2U as an example. I was choosing between going to 2U and working at Blackboard. Blackboard had just started a new company. 2U had just raised their Series A. And I went and Facebook stalked John and Chip, and I was not looking really for anything related to universities. I was looking up their personal values, and I was looking at how they treated their children and how they related their children. And so for me, I think, personally have been really fortunate to work with teams that have kept the student top of mind and have tried to research doing so in, I would say, sort of non-traditional ways.
Yeah, got it. And maybe the last question here is start, both of you have been sort of in education for a while here. What are some of the biggest trends or shifts that you're starting to see sort of on the ground level in the field that are noteworthy for especially others who are trying to build education technology companies or investing in them? Any thoughts there, just what you're hearing, seeing on the ground level, sort of big shifts that that are trending? Any thoughts, Jeremy, especially from the Khan Academy perspective?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and even a broader sort of time horizon of the last 20 years or so. And I remember coming out of an education program as an undergraduate, for-profits were really demonized in the K through 12 space. There was this company, Edison, that was like putting TVs in classrooms and broadcasting ads to students. And there was all this bad press around, how these evil for-profits are destroying education. Fast forward 20 years, now instead of this top-down kind of structure, there's actually much more of a bottoms-up approach where teachers are pulling technology into their classroom, whether or not their district leaders are on board. And we've seen it certainly this past year more than ever. And so I think what that's done is it's given education companies a role to play in the ecosystem that maybe they wouldn't have had 20 years ago when the press was so bad. But it's also raised the bar for what they're going to deliver. It's not enough anymore just to sign that contract with the CIO or the superintendent and say, hey, our stuff is just mediocre at best, but we've got you locked down with a 5-year contract. Instead, it's the teachers who are saying, you know what, this is a consumer product. And for consumer products, I'm going to be really, really fickle, the same way I am with my apps and my iPhone. I'm going to demand the best stuff for my students in my class. And if you can't deliver that, somebody else will, and I'll find them. So I think it's actually been a really healthy thing, both because EdTech companies now have a seat at the table and because the bar is higher for what they have to deliver.
Yeah. And you're seeing that switching costs are a little bit lower now for districts, organizations, teachers. Is that something you've seen as well?
Absolutely. The fact that basically a consumerized EdTech app like Kahoot could blow up and have $1 billion valuation without really even selling to schools, just by going through teachers who are pulling it into their classrooms all around the world, that would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago.
Yeah, makes sense. How about you, Jamie? What are your thoughts?
So it's interesting. So this is rare, but I would actually agree with everything Jeremy said. So I'll +1 that. I think, so if I were to sort of move to higher ed a bit, or let's call it high school and higher ed, I think the trend for the last probably almost decade has been integration of skills, right? And trying to close the skills gap. And I think, there are a lot of companies that have taken stabs at it, and a lot of companies have done amazing jobs. 3.5 million job openings every year, only 1.5 which are filled. But I don't think anyone, and listen, Trilogy clearly, so for those of you that don't know, Trilogy was a boot camp that partnered with the top universities in the country. So if you went to Harvard's data analytics program, you were at effectively a Trilogy powered program. Everybody did a great job on more short-term solutions. And I think what's coming now will be, what are long-term solutions, right? And so when you think about things like 46% of jobs require STEM degrees. Well, in the United States, only 6% of graduates have STEM degrees. That is a massive mismatch, right? And so, Jeremy, going back to what you were talking about, what I think is going to be really interesting is you talked about sort of the organic nature of Hoot. Like, what is the breakout, or what are the breakout companies in the K-12 space that are ultimately going to fuel what happens in higher ed? So I think that's one. And then I'll also, Moses, the other thing that Jeremy talked about that I think is really important, in K-12, I think it is a little bit different, but I think the overall theme that, wow, like teaching and learning is important, was really, really amplified this year. And so if you looked, one of the companies that I was a part of is a company called Engagely. And one of the things we learned as we went in to universities, to Jeremy's point, certainly was that the students had a voice. But the other piece that was interesting is as university budgets were getting slashed, right? And jobs were getting slashed, one department was growing. And that was the department or center for teaching and learning in every university in the world, all of a sudden was doubling in size. And I think that is a huge win. And if that trend can keep on going, all of a sudden education and frankly, learning outcomes and job outcomes become at the forefront, not, consumer, dollar.
Yeah. Notice that at the University of Michigan, they were, during the pandemic, that was the one area that there was hiring a lot of people in the Center for Teaching and Learning. And maybe, Jamie, just for context here, since you sort of brought it up, some of the themes you just mentioned actually relate to your latest startup, Edge Pathways. Can you just give us a 1 minute, just so for the audience to understand what Edge Pathway is about? And then we'll have Rohit ask some other follow-up questions.
Sure. So, and thank you, Moses. I actually left the name out because I was not trying to give a plug. But
that directly relates to what you're doing. So you're a great salesman, right?
Well, look, I think it's important. And certainly if you look at the trend over the last several years, it's not a secret that, boot camps sort of went on the rise. And one of the things that we learned at Trilogy, when you speak with 5,000, employers, and you hear something over and over, which is, wow, thank you so much, like data analysts, developers, if we could only find engineers, right? And so, as we started doing that research, we learned of not, the talent gap everybody talks about, right? The gap that people don't talk about is that 50 to 70% drop rate in STEM programs the first year of college, right? It's like the weed out courses. So at Edge, we felt like we could reimagine that college experience and reimagine that first year of college. Very small classes, mentor driven, industry integration, high support, on demand tutoring. If you can imagine a world where the ultimate goal is not to weed people out, but actually to ensure people are teaching and ensure people are learning. And then when you think about, sort of years 2, 3, and 4, immersives, which could be co-ops or internships in each of those years. So I think that was about a minute, maybe a little longer.
Hey, Jamie, we're really excited to even learn a little bit more throughout this webinar, but thanks for teeing that up just for context. And I'm pretty sure most of our audience is aware of what Khan Academy is. But we can dig into that a little bit more. Rohit, do you want to ask some of the topics here?
Yeah, it fits pretty nicely into kind of the next K to 12 topic. So curious, weeding out people in college is a great problem to solve. But the other problem to solve is also people who get weeded out a lot earlier in high school or even middle school, where they've, realized that maybe, oh, math is not for me or something like that. So curious, Jeremy, what you see as kind of technology that's there in the classroom today that maybe is overhyped or underhyped, to kind of help people, do these things that maybe they think are not for them, like computer science or math.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to sort of the incentives problem that I was talking about at the very beginning, which is when we talk to our district partners at Khan Academy, when I talk to teachers all day long, no one's talking about this stuff. No one's saying, hey, how can I help my students get on the right track to a great job? Because at the end of the day, they're held accountable for test scores and things like reading and math. And obviously those are foundational skills, but there's not always a clear connection between, hey, I helped you cram for this test with Khan Academy, so my test scores could look great, and now you're on a pathway to a great STEM career 10 years down the line. And so I do think there has to be kind of systemic change in terms of what those incentives are and how our structure rewards performance. Otherwise, we're always going to focus on the short-termism and never get to those long-term outcomes that Jamie mentioned.
Do you think there's going to be like a shift to more project-based work, especially with, right, like this year, I don't know, I know my cousins didn't have grades for a certain amount of time. So it's almost like maybe in the future, there could be more project-oriented kind of learning that will maybe feed better into actually retaining stuff and teachers being more aligned with kind of student learning.
Yeah, I think I'd be curious to get Jamie's take on that as well. My sense is that actually there are other nations that are investing much more in that. They're saying, hey, the work of the 21st century is project-based, it's collaborative.
Yeah.
And so I think the Chinese education system, for example, is trying to become way more focused on that, whereas the American system is becoming a little more like the Chinese system, all about test scores and getting those numbers headed in the right direction. So I would love to be optimistic about that. But again, I just don't see the forces at play that will really incentivize teachers at mass to change the way they teach in the next couple of years. Could be wrong, but I'm curious what Jamie's seeing.
I see a big EdTech opportunity there because to your point, so Jeremy, I agree with you. And, I think one of the great things about EdTech, and maybe this is me being, sort of an overly optimistic entrepreneur, is we can go in and enable educators to take risks, right? I mean, that's effectively what EdTech is. If you really think about it, it's like there's a lot of people that have different hypotheses, and very few people are going to risk their, sort of career, reputation, et cetera, in the academic space. So you have companies, Khan Academy is kind of an outsider, right? Like you guys are a little bit different, but I think if you look across, you look at the OPM companies, you look at even the LMS companies, right? Universities could build their own, but they use, so I do think there's an opportunity, that is how I view it. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, Jeremy. Like I think if the rest of the country took a good look at Northeastern and what they've done over the last 30 years, right? Or if anyone, I don't know if you guys know Emerge Education, and if there's LPs on here. I mean, Emerge wrote a great set of articles on challenger universities. So SNU, Western Governors, like there are some, certainly first movers out there, but it will be interesting to see how quickly that goes a little bit more mainstream.
What about, like, I know everyone's always talking about STEM education and Khan Academy, General Assembly, like, that's probably one of the most in demand things. But, with all the things going on in the world with, protests and Black Lives Matter and all these other things, like it's increasingly apparent that just, social sciences and understanding history and all these things are also kind of equally important. How do you see, schools balancing the, like you were saying, Jamie, like the demands of corporations and needing these, filling the skill gap with also focusing on these soft skills that have ramifications kind of at a societal level, but aren't as easy to measure, like this is going to lead to X job.
Yeah, this is such a frustrating thing for me, Rohit, because I actually, when I worked at LinkedIn, developed a whole business around soft skill instruction, trying to fill the gaps that college and even K through 12 is not sort of providing for their students. And it was interesting because LinkedIn itself was very interested in buying those services. Said, hey, like we've got all these junior salespeople, junior business development people who just aren't polished. They're not ready for prime time. And we need someone to finish them off. But I think going back to some of the things that Jamie has mentioned, like to get schools to focus on that and to say that this matters, especially in an environment where schools are getting more applications than ever before. It's certainly at the top of the tier. Like, how do you force them to change when they become addicted to the status quo? And I feel like that's really the problem with all education in America over the last 200 years, is there are so many structural forces saying, don't change, stay the same. And then they only change when it's too late in some cases. So I'm not sure what will be the destabilizing force or disrupting force, but I know that there's been a lot of sort of inertia that's held back things like soft skill education.
Jamie, do you have any thoughts on that? Or just curious, with Edge Pathways, is there any future focus on helping students who maybe are trying to tackle issues in social sciences, but maybe, feel like they can't, or maybe even like, you're from a family that's, maybe less fortunate and you feel like you have to study computer science because that's what everyone is trying to make you do, but, your real passion is somewhere else and you could have had a lot of impact.
Sorry. So I think if I take a step back, I'm going to separate this into two questions, because I think there's the soft skills question and then there's the social sciences question. And from a soft skills perspective, I thought, Jeremy, you did a really good job, in my opinion, saying sort of where we are to date. I do think there is growing slowly, sort of understanding at the collegiate level. And actually, Jeremy, a lot of it thanks to LinkedIn. I mean, when LinkedIn came out the past several years with the reports that say, here are the 10 most desired, traits that employers are looking for, everyone thought it was going to be skills, and it was like empathy, right? Like hard skills, and it was empathy. So I will tell you, and humor me, focus group of one, but at Trilogy, we had over 50,000, have had over 50,000 students go for our program. Soft skills was about a third of our curriculum. So it was built into every single part of the curriculum. And I think, Rohit, as we go back and we talk about project-based learning, the reason that's so important is not just because it's real-world application, but it also drives and facilitates soft skills, right? You have to learn how to play each of those different roles. So I think that was one piece. And the piece about social sciences, do you mind? I wanted to make sure I understood the question.
Yeah, I guess it was more of, with pressure to do, there's just a lot of forces encouraging people to do STEM, which is great. But there's also, I think, value still in studying social sciences, and we may miss some people who now feel like they have to study STEM, even if it's not something they want to do. And they're, and you can still have a lot of impact on society with, studying STEM, or sorry, studying social sciences.
Yeah, so and this is going to sound interesting so yes, I'm in education, I'm ed tech, and I firmly do believe education can and will change the world. And I don't believe degrees are for everyone, period, full stop. I certainly don't believe STEM degrees are for everyone. And so I actually look at part of our job at Edge. I don't think about us actually as trying to get people into our program. I think about us on the front end as a college counseling service. Again, it goes back to putting the student first. So, if so there's two answers, right? There's the personal answer, which I think is what I just said. I think more generally, if a student is into social sciences, and this is what I would tell somebody if they ask me, it's not going to hurt to get a STEM degree, right? STEM is big. So get a degree in math and apply it to data sets of, how to better the water flow in Africa. Like, I'm giving a very bizarre example, but I think what's interesting about STEM degrees, if you sort of take out engineering, but think of all, I think what everyone thinks is the standard STEM, and think of all that it encompasses, you can apply it anywhere, right? And even software engineering, everything's a tech company now. So it's a great question. And I like the way you framed everyone's being pushed towards STEM. It made me think of like when I was growing up, everybody, or at least in my sort of bubble, everyone had to be a doctor or a lawyer. And P.S., I went to law school and dropped out. But it's, again, I think it goes back to, do you have a STEM program or sort of mentors along the way that show you here are all the things you can do with this type of degree?
Yeah, makes total sense. Okay, one more question on this, and this is kind of a obligatory question. With COVID, there's so many things that have changed with K-12. Like, I see my own cousins, way less interested in their work, doing everything remotely. I can just imagine the mental health ramifications of this for an entire population of students. And just curious, how does EdTech fit into that, or help solve kind of some of these system-wide changes that have now occurred? Or what is going to go back to normal, maybe, if anything, in your opinions? Jamie or Jeremy?
So the short answer is, I don't think we know, right? I mean, we can all talk about what we think or what we want. I can't speak much for K-12, which Jeremy can. And I think, going back to sort of what I said at the beginning, I think this is a more generally speaking positive for education in general. It may take a while to get there as we sort of flow back to that quote unquote new normal. But I do think over the next 5 to 10 years, this is going to be something that was very positive and force people to really get a good understanding of why having great teachers and great learning tools are important. But Jeremy, I feel like this is one where you're going to have a lot more. I mean, you see the data on Khan Academy, you really know, the numbers. I can speak to it, but you actually know what's going on.
Yeah, I'm still trying to piece it all together, but I will say, even more than the numbers, I'm seeing the emotion. And so, what I was talking about in terms of the consumerization of EdTech, at least at the K-12 level over the last 20 years, has certainly accelerated in the last year. Basically in the span of March to April 2020, I had hundreds of thousands of teachers coming to me who had never taught with anything more sophisticated than a chalkboard for 30 years. And now we're doing Google Classroom and Khan Academy and all this stuff. And so there isn't a willingness to try new things that was basically thrust upon people. That being said, the honest truth is that a lot of people's experiences were disastrous. Teachers, parents, students, everything sucked. Like, it didn't work as well as it should. stuff wasn't built for this moment, ready for the sort of level of sort of awesome education that students were used to in the classroom. And so I do think that coming out of this, yeah, there may be some families that opt to stay remote even into 2022 and beyond, and maybe there'll be some school districts that continue to innovate. But I think there'll be a feeling of, we don't want to be experimented on anymore. We don't want to be sort of the guinea pigs for an edtech company, large or small. Instead, if you are serious about building, you got to be building with us and for us, not just for your venture capital masters trying to make a quick buck off us. And so I think that's ultimately a good forcing function, which says, hey, edtech is not the Wild West anymore. EdTech is center stage in this world. And if it's going to deserve that place and hold that place, it's going to have to deliver the goods in terms of high quality and a great user experience. So definitely not just this like rosy bag that some folks have positioned it as like, oh, this is EdTech's moment and we're going to be totally here forever. Instead, it's like, yeah, we are now partners, but there's big expectations on these partners and they better deliver.
And actually, Jeremy and Jamie, this is a good segue sort of in terms of, you're partnering with teachers, school districts. They're very important and they're going to influence sort of the product and the services. We're starting to see corporations now as this really major stakeholder. Obviously we've seen maybe the announcement that Google plans to have their own certification courses coming out. More and more companies are sort of, trying to influence higher education and K-12. Just by the way, Jeremy, my sons took a little bit of the training on Pixar in the Box from Khan Academy. He's wanted to learn more about Pixar and see the influence of corporations in terms of education. What are your thoughts on sort of companies having this new seat at the table and actually wanting to maybe even grab more seats at the table to influence the future of education? I know, Jamie, with your new company, definitely involving corporations more and more in sort of influencing curriculum and sort of long-term outcomes. But love to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe, Jamie, can start with you in terms of role of the corporation in education now.
So let's start with, I'm completely biased. But I think, look, I mean, General Assembly, I think, was sort of the first clear mover in the space. Maybe not the first, but certainly one of the first. I can tell you between General Assembly, Trilogy, I mean, the curriculum was, I'm going to say 80% employer driven. And it was a living, breathing curriculum, right? So it changed in real time with recommended changes from employers. So I think more generally, there are jobs that require skills, just hard skills, right? Not just hard skills, but I would say, like, I think of them as, vocational schools, of vocational jobs of more of the digital age. Then there's this bucket of, I'm going to call it more intense degree work, where typically it will take a company, 6 to 18 months to onboard somebody. Why wouldn't you just integrate that into the degree? I mean, it just seems like a no-brainer. And there's, even very simplified versions of that. Like I'll use myself as an example. If I knew that I could get a master's in information sciences and come out at the same time with the Salesforce developer license, heck yeah, I would do that, right? Why not? I'd certainly make my husband do it, right? But, something like that seems like a no-brainer. So I'm super excited about corporations having more of a seat at the table. I think the other piece of that becomes really interesting, and I'm not sure, I'll use Pepsi as an example. One of the things we're seeing is chief talent officers and chief learning officers are more and more being hired out of higher ed. So Pepsi's CLO, Molly Nagler, has done an amazing job. She came out of Yale. She's brought in into Pepsi. She brought in Degreed. She's brought in Guild. And so she's done a great job sort of helping bridge that gap. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. So I think it's a great thing. And I actually think it would be even better if and when, let's use Google. Google's probably the worst example because they can get whoever they want. But as these companies come out with certificates, it's going to be interesting to see how many people from higher ed make the jump into corporate.
Yeah. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was really excited about the Google thing, not so much about the training, but about the hiring aspect. Because I think the fact that companies haven't really provided a clear on-ramp to getting hired, aside from get a college degree, preferably at a school that we also went to as the hiring managers, has propped up higher education. That's the reason why there hasn't been a focus on soft skills or all this other stuff, because as long as you went to Stanford or MIT or Michigan, you were golden. It didn't really matter what happened in those 4 years. And so if the companies are really committed from Google on down to saying, hey, we're going to hire based on skills, regardless of what your parchment says, then that would be a sea change.
Yep.
And I do think that ultimately the test will be at that recruiter level and hiring manager level where, yeah, everyone's going to sort of speak the language of, yeah, we're closing the skills gap and we're hiring equitably. But then you look at Google itself, where they knew they had to hire for more HBCUs, and they consistently botched it and got in their own way of working with Howard and other schools to hire from that great talent pipeline. And so if schools can actually, or companies can actually commit to saying, hey, it's all about the skills, it's all about your ability to do the job and not just be a culture fit, AKA one of us,
Yep.
AKA a part of the homogenous hive mind at Google, then that will be a real difference maker.
Yeah, and Jeremy, just sort of pulling on this thread a little bit longer, how do you see this influencing sort of K-12 education or even Khan? So with, maybe people are reconsidering what they think of higher education with such the massive costs and companies trying to, go even earlier in terms of its influence. And any thoughts on that and how it's influencing even K-12 education?
Yeah, I do think that, and maybe this is sort of what Jamie was getting at before, when there are failures in the economic alignments and incentives within the system, the wealthiest, most privileged in our society find a way around that. And so I think that Class Dojo thing that I linked to in the chat was a good example. So I have some friends over at Class Dojo, which is this EdTech startup, and they've tried to sell to schools and districts for a long, long time. But like with many EdTech entrepreneurs, they found it kind of frustrating. And they say, you know what? Like instead of trying to force these district leaders to care about things like project-based learning and collaborative teamwork and all this, what if we just go to all the tiger moms and tiger dads of America and say, hey, like, don't you want your kids to be ready to compete with, these amazing liberal arts trained Chinese students in 10 years, or these Stanford grads in 5 years? You can actually buy them access to this more holistic educational experience today that your own school system is not providing. And so that's totally dispiriting because, again, it's breaking down the very meritocracy that we like to believe our society is built upon. But I do think, again, there's just not enough demand on our K-12 education system to connect to employment outcomes. I think anytime, whether it's climate change or COVID or whatever, that we have to do any kind of long-term thinking to connect the dots, it's just hard to build those linkages.
Yeah, I love that example. And maybe just to follow up, do you think parents and families are going to take a little bit more ownership of their children's education? Obviously, you saw with COVID, a lot of homeschooling and alternative education pathways opening up. Do you think you're going to just see people say, hey, forget the system. I know these skills are really important, and we're just going to do something different? So either Jeremy or Jamie, love your thoughts on that.
So I think that will happen, and I don't think it's a good thing in some cases, but namely, to go back, when you think about the equality gap that I think, or even that opportunity gap that probably everybody that is on here has been focused on for so long, I feel like as that's happening, and even from COVID, like that opportunity gap has just widened, right? And certainly, we can speak to, and Moses, I don't mean my child also, we did the Pixar thing. But think about, the 30% of the population where they don't have access to a computer, or the other 20% that while they have access, the internet's not enough to watch. So in some ways, it leaves kind of the same gaping hole that I think, or widens the gaping hole. But again, like, because I'm an overly optimistic entrepreneur, I immediately turn that into, that's a great problem to solve, and let's think about how we can solve that. But that's a big one.
Yeah, it's a great point. Like, what opportunities do you see within kind of the diversity and inclusion space for maybe a new startup to kind of tackle that maybe hasn't been, addressed to date? I know your company obviously tries to tackle that to some extent. I'm just curious, broadly, what are your thoughts there? Like, how would you characterize like the different, it's a big question. Like, how would you characterize like maybe some of the different areas within diversity inclusion that a startup might go after? Because it's a huge broad problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think there's, so if I were to completely oversimplify this, right? I'm gonna, so let's go into talent. I'm using talent as an example. I'm recruiting right now, right? I know that, I mean, not only do we know the data, but I know from past experience, we want a diverse team. Our network, right, are similar folks. We're not going to get that many different referrals from our network and or different types of individuals. And what I've spent the last couple of weeks doing, and I know as soon as I say this, I'm going to get 87 links thrown at me, so I probably should have posted this on LinkedIn in the first place. I said, is there any website that I can go to and just search for diversity of some sort? Like, how do I filter for this? I know how to filter on LinkedIn for other things. Is there a way to filter on, and so a way that's more targeted and more simple than LinkedIn, right? You could even think about AngelList having that type. So that to me is an opportunity, right? Like a very sort of niche, small, doesn't take a bunch of investment, get a couple developers together opportunity. I think there's a huge opportunity to figure out how to develop programs with massive CSR departments, right? I mean, there's millions and billions of dollars in CSR right now being spent on education.
Sorry, could you clarify what CSR means for those that don't know?
Oh, sorry, corporate social responsibility. It's funny when you said that, I was like, oh, right. So I think there's an opportunity there to develop programs that can sort of function as, let's call it nonprofit. So I think I don't have any great answers on that one, probably because I'm heads down focused on my own thing. But what I would say is I think a lot of people are trying. And we just have to wait and see who comes out on top, and then, what type of impact they can make. I mean, it's so big, right? Like, it's just so big that I think, out of the 100 companies that are trying, if 10 make it, it's still, I'm not sure what dent it makes in the short term.
Yeah, that's a great answer. One other aspect that I was thinking about, maybe Jeremy, you have thoughts on this, is, with tools like Khan Academy and other kind of micro learning opportunities, like how does that fit into maybe making the curriculum itself more reflective of, diversity and making people that take those classes feel like they're included?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that pretty much every education organization, for profit or nonprofit, has in common is their mission statement is basically, we are making access to high quality education available to everyone around the world, or everyone around the country. And I think that like technology by its definition has made the first part of that, access, really easy. So you think about Khan Academy, just throwing up YouTube videos explaining everything from, algebra to calculus was a game changer, because no matter where you were sitting, if you could tap into that, had access to a really robust curriculum. The problem is the high quality part of it. Like, technology can definitely drive down costs, but can it actually drive up quality? Can it make education even better than it is today? Better than sitting in a boring lecture, having your professor drone on, and actually make it engaging, interactive, sticky, and useful in your future. And so I think a little bit about Netflix's journey, right? When Netflix first went all digital, all streaming, they drove down the cost of watching each movie, versus going to Blockbuster and paying $3 or $5 a pop. You could now watch 100 movies for the same price. But the movies sucked, if you recall. The catalog was terrible at first. And then they said, we're going to do the really hard thing. We did the easy thing, putting it online, no problem. But the hard thing is to develop amazing content that's even better than what's out there already. And yet they went out there and did it, and they invest in it. And it was a long-term play, and probably a lot of shareholders thought they were crazy. But now everyone's sort of chasing in their wake. And so who's going to be the Khan Academy on the high quality side of things that says, hey, everyone has thrown up stuff online over the last 10 years, and that's awesome. But who's going to deliver even better education than the Harvard, Stanfords, and MITs of the world are delivering today? If someone can crack that nut and do it at scale, I think that's the secret to really unlocking the access and high quality of those mission statements.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy, for sharing that, and Jamie, all your thoughts here. We want to just open up for some Q&A right now. And maybe I want to sort of bring up a question that came up earlier related to the test prep space, entrance exams, private school entrance exams. As we know, during COVID, many institutions said test optional, no more tests, and applications surged. What are your thoughts for both of you, sort of what you're seeing? And I know, Khan Academy has its own test prep site, and maybe you've seen some data there. And Jamie, you're obviously trying to bring people in through sort of EDGE pathway into first year programs. What are your thoughts on test prep going forward? Maybe we'll start with Jamie. What do you think? What is your perspective?
I think it's too soon to tell. I know that's not a great perspective, but I also don't want to make something up for the sake of having an answer. Yeah. I think it's too soon to tell. My gut is there will always be a market for test prep, because there's always going to be parents that are willing to pay for their kid, for even if it's fake, for their kid to have the perception of having a leg up, right? And I think that on the university side, for the universities that are smart, which I think a lot of them are, and I don't know if they're doing this now or not, even if they waive the scores, maybe save a few seats or X% of those seats for only people that have the scores, and then they'll get more applicants. So my gut is test prep is not going away, but changing. I could be wrong.
And how does EDGE pathway see this sort of in your application process and admissions to your program in college?
So we launch, when do we launch? Monday, publicly. So we will know then.
Okay, perfect. Great answer. Great answers. Really, I can't wait. I'll be waiting on that website to see if I can apply. Okay, what do you think? What are your thoughts, Jeremy, on this test prep process?
Yeah, so Khan Academy is kind of an interesting player in the space, because obviously our primary focus is on equity and access to high quality education, as I mentioned, but we are the official partner of the College Board for SAT prep. And so, absolutely, we've seen decreased usage of that product as it's become less and less important in the past year. And I do wonder, to the extent that, again, there is this status quo bias within higher education, if there's maybe not enough supporting tissue or enough foundational structures built in to really force SAT and ACT back into prominence in the future. Once we've broken that linkage, yes, there's still this sort of industrial military complex of SAT prep and tutors and all this stuff that have incentives to keep the system alive. But if you're an admissions officer and you were able to do your job just as well this past year, and you've always told yourself, by the way, you said well, I need the SAT to level the playing field, to give me an apples to apples comparison across students. And then without the SAT, you were able to do the exact same thing. To me, maybe that magic spell is broken a little bit and you don't have to go back to it. So it could be a rare example of just sort of, having that sort of initial push that gets the change done. An interesting example I heard was that apparently 20 or 30 years ago, there was a strike on the underground in London. And it lasted for only 2 or 3 days, when all these workers all across the city had to find these new commutes. But even after 5 or 10 years after the strike ended, apparently something like 20% of the commuters were still going on different routes to work based on the ones they had found in those 2 or 3 days when things had changed. So if there's not the scaffold to support necessarily the importance of test prep and SAT and whatever at the admissions level, maybe that will be a permanent change coming out of this crazy year.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I love it for my children not to necessarily stress out all summer long, right? Given that I'm Asian American and spend so many of my summers just taking test prep. Parents encouraged me to do that, of course, and incentivized me at the same time. But that, we had a previous comment just around, and Jeremy, you kind of mentioned this, how do you at some point maybe have MIT, Stanford type quality that's more accessible to folks in terms of sort of curriculum and content. One thing I wanted to bring up and sort of related to some of the questions I've been asked is around sort of this, the idea of cohort experience and learning from peers. Obviously, it's very difficult to replicate that at scale online. And that's why you're still going to see people go to Harvard, Yale, the MITs, Michigans, because of that network that they're going to gain in the peer-to-peer interactions. Any thoughts on that, and how do you sort of democratize that or open that up so that it's not just for the elite, or there's all these high bars that people have to pass to sort of gain that network, gain that peer group that's going to help you in your future and your career? Any thoughts around that from either of you? Maybe we'll start with Jamie, because I know you're going to start building cohorts here, but love your thoughts and perspectives on that. Yeah, and how you take that away from like the Stanfords and the MITs of the world.
So I think there's two ways to think about it. One, sort of as part of education, as part of an education experience or the student experience, and two, actually more just socially and generally. So if I were to start, I'm going to use 2U as an example. Back in the day, I think about 10 years ago, 2U built programs where people, and this is true, has happened in multiple programs. The networks were so tight that there were people that met online in the Masters in Teaching and Learning program and were married 6 months later, right? So I say that to make the point that it certainly is possible when there is a lot of thought and purpose put into it. I think as I, learned so much working with Daphne and Dan at Engagely, there are numerous things pedagogically that you can do online better than in a classroom, right? So Jigsaw is a great example, especially, when you talk about sort of diversity, right? And inclusivity, much easier to do online than in person. So I actually I don't believe that online, sort of the in-person network is easier to create in person. I don't believe a network is, I believe that it is what we've done, and we haven't had as much time or put as much thought into the online. I think if we were, as we continue to be purposeful in that endeavor, that is going to be more of the future. And it's a larger opportunity, right? Like, let's call it what it is. At UF, yeah, everyone that goes to UF, but like, okay, 60% of them are from Florida, probably 30% from Long Island. Like, they're not that different. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. Definitely, I think really good insights there, as well as painting a picture of opportunity in this space online. It's just underdeveloped, is what I'm hearing you say.
I think so. Or I would, and well developed in small spaces.
Yeah.
Do you think people will end up being part of like multiple elite communities? Like, I know myself, just, my 3 years, like I did a program called Venture for America, and then there's like On Deck now that everyone's doing. And I feel like there's all these different communities that offer maybe a piece of what like an elite school offers, but it's for something like really specific. And so you don't have to pay whatever the 200 grand to go to business school or whatever grad program, and you can kind of make your own like community based off of like what you're interested in.
Yeah. What do you think, Jeremy? Any final thoughts there on this topic?
Just really quickly, I think there's two things that we've probably already touched on a little bit that'll be important. If, again, truly employers embrace the skill-based hiring, that maybe breaks the monopoly on the old boys network referral process a little bit, where all of a sudden a recruiter can't override the fact that someone's really good at this job just because someone was frat brothers with someone at Stanford. So I think that would be important. And then a sort of more bottoms up approach, I think just the democratization of tech tools and creation tools in general mean that more people can be building stuff and getting collaborative hands-on experiences outside of school. If we put all of our hope in the education formal bucket, that schools will magically transform and become these incubators of creativity and collaboration, that's likely not to be fruitful in the next decade or so. But if people can be doing that on their own, and no matter what community they're from, no matter what tech tools they have access to, I think that builds out the kinds of networks and the kinds of experiences and track records that any employer would be enticed by.
Yeah, makes sense. Just with the time remaining, a few minutes before noon, 1 o'clock Eastern at least, any last advice for, say, entrepreneurs who are on this call, who are starting their venture, and what suggestions, advice do you have for them? Maybe we'll start with you, Jamie.
They're wrong. Right? No. I mean,
yeah.
So like when people ask, why was Trilogy so successful so quickly? I mean, I think people think it's a joke, but we had an exec team that had complementary skills. We always assumed we were wrong. And therefore, when you bring all those skills to a table, your plans B, C, D, and E turn out to be pretty different. One of them usually works. So I think like as long as you can check your ego at the door, that's sort of where it starts. And just keep going, right? That's the other piece of this. Like, I think people just assume, oh, product market fit, or, oh, it's just going to work, or just keep going.
Great advice. To grind at times. So
grind and you're not smart. That's my advice.
and surround yourself with really good people, it sounds like, too, who are complimentary.
And then take credit for them.
Totally. Okay. Jeremy, any thoughts for our audience here?
Just totally agree with Jamie. I think one of the biggest EdTech success stories of the past 10 or 20 years have been the Kopp brothers from Michigan who started Remind. And the interesting thing about them is they didn't come from an education background. They weren't teachers. But instead of doing what so many sort of product managers and founders do, which is I'll do some market research, I'll do a focus group or a survey, and then I'll go off and build stuff on my own. They took this more sort of collaborative route of co-creation, literally sitting with teachers and saying, okay, here's what the app looks like today. And the teacher says, no, that's terrible. That's terrible. Change this and change that. And then they would build it and come back with the next one. And I think that's way more labor intensive, and it leads to more ego deflation moments like Jamie was talking about, but it keeps you honest. Like if you're building for teachers, if you're building for students, get them involved at the very beginning, build them into the DNA of your organization, not just as an afterthought.
Makes sense. You're muted, Rohit. This is the world of Zoom. You're
cool. Well, with that, I think we're right on the hour. So I think this is a pretty good place to close. I think you should be able to see my screen, but Jeremy, Jamie, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us and for dealing with my back and forth emails a bunch. So really appreciate that. And just small plug for any entrepreneurs in the audience, feel free to contact me. My email is rohit@grandbcp.com. We love to hear from everyone, and I will reply to everyone. And then just a small plug for the next webinar, which will be on April 22nd with Will Boglin, and that's more on healthcare. So thanks all of you, and Moses, thank you as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeremy, Jamie, and Jamie. Really excited for Edge Pathway to launch on Monday. Can't wait. And just where can we learn more about either Edge Pathway or Khan Academy? Any last plugs from our guests? Edgepathway.com?
Sure. Yeah, go to the website.
Okay, great. And Khan Academy, I think, is pretty easy to find. KhanAcademy.com. So anyway, everyone, hopefully everyone has a great rest of the day. And thank you for joining us. And thank you again to our Jeremy and Jamie. And hope we can all meet in person sometime soon.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.